The Predator Academy had trained the deadliest killers in 47 star systems. Then a paperwork mistake admitted a human. 6 weeks later, the galaxy was rewriting its definition of a predator. My name is Commander Vreth Okalos, of the Korhan Defense Coalition, stationed at Voth Station, which is the official, respectable name for what the cadets quietly call the Grinder. Voth Station hosts the Predator Academy, the single most selective, most dangerous, most gloriously brutal military training institution in the known galaxy. We have graduated Korhan warbeasts who could split a reinforced hull door with their bare fists. We have trained Dravathi assassins who could stop a target's heart from 3 corridors away using nothing but sound frequencies. We have shaped the finest killers in 47 star systems. What we had never done, not once in 312 years of operation, was accidentally admit a human. The transfer file landed on my console at 06 station time. I read it 3 times. Then I called my adjutant Sirkin over and made him read it too because I genuinely believed something had gone wrong with my visual processors. "Sir," Sirkin said slowly, his secondary eyelids blinking in that particular way that means he is also confused and is trying very hard not to show it. "It says the candidate was routed here from a diplomatic internship program on Harath Station." "Yes," I said. "And the species classification says human." "Yes," I said again. "Should we correct the error?" I looked at the file. I looked at my adjutant. I looked back at the file. The human's name was listed as Caden Rourke. Age, 26 years by Earth reckoning. Prior experience, listed as varied. That was all. "No," I said, and I still cannot fully explain why. "Let him come." Sirkin stared at me with all 4 of his eyes. "Sir, with respect, the paperwork is already processed, Sirkin. Do you want to file the correction forms, in triplicate, before the shuttle arrives in 2 hours?" He did not want to file the correction forms. Nobody corrected it. The shuttle docked at 0822. I was not there personally for the arrival. I had my dignity to consider, but I did access the bay surveillance feed from my office, which is basically the same thing, except with more plausible deniability. 17 cadets were already assembled in the docking bay, having arrived on the same transport from various corners of the galaxy. There was Threx Boravane, a Dakari reptilian standing 7 feet tall, with scales the color of old blood and a jaw that could crack through reinforced plating. There was Soraveth, from the Quilathi web species, 8-limbed and silk-quick, known for her kind's ability to process threat assessments in under 1/10 of a second. There was Bolt Karn, a Grevish bruiser built like a small geological feature, roughly 400 kilograms of living granite, with a bad attitude and apparently excellent grades in tactical demolition. Then there was Caden Rourke. He stepped off the shuttle, carrying 1 bag. 1. Every other cadet had equipment cases, weapon lockers, ceremonial armor, the usual showing off that happens when apex predators gather in one place. Caden Rourke had a single canvas bag slung over one shoulder, a jacket that looked like it had been slept in, and the particular expression of a being who had either seen everything already or had not yet realized where he was. There was a silence in the bay that I can only describe as profound. Threx Boravane looked at the human the way you might look at something you found in your meal that should not be there. Soraveth's 8 eyes tracked Caden's every movement with the precise automatic focus of a species that has been hunting things for millennia. Bolt Karn, bless his dense and magnificent heart, leaned toward his neighbor and said, at a volume he clearly thought was a whisper, "What is that?" Caden Rourke looked around the bay. He looked at the 7-foot blood-scaled reptilian, the 8-limbed silk assassin, the 400-kilogram geological bruiser, and the assorted other weapons-grade predators surrounding him. He took a slow breath. He rolled his neck. That particular human motion, the one that produces a sound like small bones settling, and then he walked to his assigned bunk assignment board as if he were late for a meeting he had already decided was not that important. He did not run. He did not freeze. He did not make any of the sounds that prey species make when surrounded by predators. This, I would later learn, should have been my first warning. Day 1 at Voth Station begins the same way it always has, for every cadet of every species in 312 years of operation. You enter the Hunger Maze. The maze is a 2-kilometer closed course built into the lower decks of the station. It is dark. It is loud with artificial ambient noise designed to disorient. Somewhere inside it, depending on the week's rotation, there is a live predator, drawn from our holding stock of species we have catalogued as biologically hazardous. That particular week, we were running a Deathworld stalker, 6-legged, heat-sensing, approximately the mass of a ground transport vehicle, and objectively terrible to be in an enclosed space with. The test is simple. Enter the maze. Survive 6 hours. Exit. How you survive is your business. Most cadets fight. Dakari like Threxboravane use raw physical dominance. They find the Deathworld. They engage it. They either win or they do not. Quilathi like Soraveth go invisible against the walls and simply avoid contact entirely, threading through the maze with a speed and stillness that the stalker's heat sensors struggle to track. Grevash like Bolt Khan just walk through walls if the path annoys them. Different approaches, all effective in their own species-specific ways. Caden Rourke was in the maze for approximately 40 minutes before the surveillance feed showed him doing something none of our monitoring staff had ever seen in 3 centuries of operation. He sat down. "Is he?" My surveillance officer, Gental, began. "Quiet," I said. Caden was not simply sitting, he was listening. His head moved in small, careful increments, tracking sounds our instruments could barely register. The Deathworld was in the northern quadrant, Caden was in the southeast. The stalker had not detected him yet, because Caden had, apparently instinctively, positioned himself in a section of the maze where the ambient piped-in noise was loudest, masking his heat signature in the audio interference pattern. He sat there for another 20 minutes. Then he started collecting things. A length of cable from a maintenance panel he pried open with something from his jacket pocket. 3 pieces of structural debris from a section of wall that had sustained damage in a previous cadet's slightly too enthusiastic exit attempt. The remains of a lighting fixture, his bootlaces, and I want to be very clear that he removed the laces from his actual boots, retied them into a specific knot configuration I did not recognize, and then walked in bootless socks for the remainder of the exercise because apparently that was an acceptable trade. He built a trap in 40 minutes. Out of garbage and his own shoelaces. The Deathworld found him in hour 3, or rather, it found the cable he had strung across the corridor at precisely the height of the stalker's primary leg joints. The trap triggered. The Deathworld went down with a crash that registered on the station's structural sensors. When our recovery team entered the maze at the 6-hour mark, they found the stalker hogtied, and I am using that word deliberately, because it is apparently an Earth term for this specific configuration, using bootlaces, cable, and what appeared to be a sleeve from Caden's jacket, which was now a vest. There was a small piece of torn cloth tucked under the stalker's foreleg. Written on it in standard Galactic script, meaning Caden had taken the time to find a writing instrument, translate his message, and leave a note, was the phrase, "Good boy, sorry about the laces." My surveillance officer stared at the screen for a very long time. "Should I log this as a pass?" she finally asked. "Yes," I said. "Log it as a pass." Voth Station runs a communal meal period at 13 o'clock. This is, in practice, less a meal period and more a daily exercise in demonstrating social hierarchy, because when you put the galaxy's most competitive apex predators in a room with food and nowhere specific to be, they are going to sort themselves out one way or another. Caden Rourke collected his meal, and I will note that he asked the food station attendant 3 questions about the ingredients before accepting anything, which the attendant, a Koran named Pesh, found so unusual that she mentioned it to me personally afterward, and sat at the end of a table near the far wall, back to the corner, facing the room. Threxboravane watched him sit down. Then Threxboravane walked over, reached across the table, and took Caden's food tray. Now, I have seen this maneuver executed on roughly 40% of first-year cadets. It is a dominance gesture. It is not about the food. It is about establishing clearly and publicly where you stand in the hierarchy of the room. The expected responses are, challenge, submission, or removal from the situation. Caden looked at his now empty place in front of him. Then he looked up at Threx Boravane. Then he looked back at the empty place. He waited 4 full seconds. I know because Jintal timed it on the surveillance log later, because nobody in the monitoring room could quite believe what they were watching. 4 seconds of complete stillness. No muscle tension visible in his face. No change in his breathing. He simply looked, with the particular quality of attention that you give to a problem you have not yet decided whether to bother solving. Then he reached out, calmly, and took the tray back. Threx Boravane, who, I want to emphasize, is 7 feet tall and could bend a structural support beam with his hands, did not move. There is a thing that happens in nature, across dozens of species and hundreds of documented encounters, that biologists call predator recognition paralysis. It is when a creature, regardless of its own formidable capabilities, encounters something that triggers an ancient, deep-wired signal in their nervous system. A signal that says, "This one is not prey." Sora Veth, from her seat 2 tables over, leaned toward Bult Cairn and said something in Quilathi that our translation systems rendered as, "That's stillness. That is not patience, that is calculation." Bult Cairn ate his meal and said nothing. Threx Boravane walked back to his own table. He also said nothing. Caden ate his food. He did not look up again. Formal sparring rotations began on day 4. Let me describe the Voth Station combat assessment format, because it matters. Each cadet fights every other cadet once in week 1. The results determine track placement for the remainder of the program. There are no weight classes, no species adjustments, no apologies for biological disparity. You fight who you fight, and you perform or you do not. Caden Rourke lost his first match. Badly, if we are being precise. Sora Veth had him pinned in under 40 seconds, which is the second fastest first-round pin in station history. He lay on the mat for a moment, staring at the ceiling with an expression I was beginning to recognize as his version of deep thought. Then he got up, gave a short nod to Sora Veth, and walked off the floor. His second match was 4 days later, against the same opponent. It lasted 11 minutes. He lost that one too, but barely, and in a completely different way than the first time. The grip attempts, the weight distribution, the angle of approach, everything had changed. Sora Veth won, but she came off the floor rolling a shoulder joint that she spent 20 minutes seeing the medical officer about afterward. By his 5th match, I had pulled every recording of his previous 4 and spent an evening watching them in sequence. He did not fight with strength. He could not. He was outmassed by every single cadet in the program, in some cases by margins that should have been comedic. He did not fight with speed. Several of his opponents could move at rates his human reflexes simply could not match. What he did, and I want to be precise here, because this is the part that made my report to High Command run to 40 pages, was fight with information. He spent the first match learning. Not winning, not surviving well, not even making a good showing, just learning. The second match, he used everything he had collected. By the third, he was pulling patterns from his opponents that they themselves did not know they had. A particular tell in Threx Boravane's left shoulder before a right-side strike, a half-second delay in Bult Cairn's secondary defensive response that opened a specific window for redirection. He could not overpower anyone, so he overclocked them instead. He fought in a way that made his opponent's own bodies betray them. The instructor staff started reviewing his footage in private after week 2. Nobody said anything officially, but I noticed that the session recordings for Cadet Rourke had more review timestamps on them than any other file in the system. He won 4 of his last 6 matches, against species that should have been able to end that conversation physically before it started. Something was happening, and nobody could quite put words to what it was. It is a tradition at Voth Station, unofficial, unsanctioned, completely ignored by administration, because it has happened every year for longer than most of the instructors have been alive, that senior cadets visit first-year dormitories in the small hours to conduct what is euphemistically called orientation exercises. In practice, it is hazing, loud, physical, and designed to establish that the senior cadets are at the top of the station hierarchy and everyone below them should be appropriately awed by this fact. On the 19th night of the first session, a group of 4 senior cadets, 2 Dakari, 1 Grevash, 1 Tulvak, entered the first-year dormitory wing at approximately 03 station time and made their way to Caden Rourke's bunk room. They had chosen him specifically. I found this out later. They had discussed it. They had agreed that the human was strange and the strangeness needed addressing, and what better way to address strangeness than to make it very clear at 3 in the morning that whatever Caden thought he was doing at this station, he was still the smallest thing in the building. They opened the door to his room. He was already awake. He was sitting cross-legged on his bunk in complete darkness. The room light had not activated, which meant he had either manually disabled the motion sensor or positioned himself outside its trigger zone, and either option is notable, and he was running something against the edge of the wall near his bunk. A slow, rhythmic scraping sound. The kind of sound that, once you hear it in complete darkness, becomes the only sound in your awareness. He was sharpening a spoon, not a weapon, not a blade, a meal hall spoon. Standard issue, the kind given to every cadet for their first week. He was sharpening it against the wall in the dark, in silence, at 3 in the morning, with the absolute focused calm of someone who had been doing this for a while and intended to keep doing it for a while longer. He did not say anything. He did not turn on the light. He did not look up. The 4 senior cadets stood in the doorway for approximately 6 seconds. Then they left. The Grevish cadet told his bunkmate about it the following morning, who told someone else, and by meal period the story had traveled to every corner of the station in the way that genuinely strange stories always do, fast, slightly distorted, and with a tone that nobody could quite categorize as either respect or fear, but lived somewhere in between. Caden came to breakfast that morning, sat in his corner, and ate his food. Nobody sat next to him. But 3 cadets in his immediate vicinity ate their meals faster than usual, and none of them looked directly at him while they did it. I stopped laughing somewhere around day 22. I am not sure exactly when. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no particular incident that flipped a switch. It was more that I realized, reviewing the week's cadet assessments at the end of a long shift, that I had written more notes about Cadet Rourke than about any other 10 cadets combined, and almost none of those notes were dismissive anymore. I pulled his file. The full file, not the transferred enrollment form that had started this whole situation, but the background data that our intake systems automatically compile for all cadets from known species databases. Earth. Planet designation SOL3. Species, Homo sapiens. Status, Class 4 Emerging Civilization, roughly 200 standard years of interstellar presence. Biological classification, soft tissue bipedal, no natural armor, no venom glands, no prehensile secondary limbs. Average lifespan, relatively short by galactic standards, but they pack it full. Then the history. I read for a very long time. Humans had been in continuous, documented, recorded armed conflict with each other for as far back as their historical record existed. Not as a sign of failure, not as a symptom of a broken species, as a feature. They had fought over land, over belief systems, over resources, over abstract philosophical disagreements, over the particular tone of voice used in a letter sent 300 years prior. They had developed weapons, deployed them, suffered catastrophic losses, rebuilt, redeveloped better weapons, and done the entire sequence again and again and again. They had faced extinction-level events, natural ones, self-inflicted ones, combinations of both, and they had not stopped, not once. They had lost, systemically and thoroughly and repeatedly, and then they had gotten back up and continued. No other species in our database had a history that looked like that. Most species either developed sufficient power to stop fighting each other early, or destroyed themselves before reaching the stars. Humans had done neither. They had simply kept going, fueled by some internal mechanism that our biologists had spent decades trying to identify and classify, and had ultimately filed under unclear, possibly pathological, monitor closely. I sat at my console until 04 o'clock. Then I opened a priority channel to High Command and filed an emergency reclassification request for species Homo sapiens, with a single covering note that read, "Do not send this species back. Do not, under any circumstances, make them feel unwelcome. And whatever you do not lose track of where they are." The final examination at Voth Station is called, in official documentation, the Autonomous Survival Assessment. What cadets call it is less printable in formal records. The premise is direct. You are transported to a designated hostile environment. In Session 47, this was a moon designated Keth 9, a low-atmosphere body with a surface temperature that cycles between unpleasant and genuinely hostile over a 16-hour day-night period. The moon has native wildlife that regards anything moving as either a threat or a meal. And somewhere on that moon, for the 72 hours of the assessment, there are trained trackers, professional hunters drawn from species with exceptional pursuit capabilities, whose job is to find you. If they find you, you fail. If you survive 72 hours without being located, you pass. The loophole, and it is not a loophole so much as a theoretical option that nobody had ever operationally exercised, is that the assessment does not technically specify that cadets must remain in a defensive posture. The parameters say survive. They do not say hide. Every cadet in the history of the program had hidden. Caden Rourke started hunting the hunters at approximately the 18-hour mark. Our tracking team, monitoring all cadets via long-range passive scanners because we were not going to leave assessment participants genuinely unobserved on a hostile moon, regardless of what the official documentation implied, noticed it first as an anomaly. The tracker teams were covering ground efficiently, closing in on cadet positions in the standard search pattern. Then one team stopped moving. Then a second team stopped moving. When we sent a status ping to the tracker team leads, we got the following responses, in order. Tracker Team Vorath. We have located Cadet Rourke. Update. Cadet Rourke has located us first. We are currently assessing the situation. Tracker Team Sen. No response for 11 minutes. Then, request clarification on assessment parameters, specifically the section regarding tracker team conduct when the cadet has established a positional advantage. By hour 36, 5 of the 6 tracker teams had been found by Caden before they found him. He had not harmed any of them. He had not needed to. He had simply appeared from a direction they were not watching in a moment when their attention was divided, and made it very clear that if this had been an actual engagement, the conversation would have ended differently. He left each team with a small note, written in standard Galactic script on strips of material torn from his jacket, which by this point had been reduced to its structural minimum in the ongoing service of note-writing and trap materials. The notes all said the same thing. Better luck next time, Zolri R. At hour 71, with 1 hour remaining on the clock, the 6th and final tracker team found him, or rather, he allowed them to find him, because by any technical assessment of his positioning, if he had not chosen to be visible, they would have passed within 20 meters of him and seen nothing. He stood up from behind a rock formation, hands visible, and said something that our audio pickup translated as "good effort." The tracker team lead, a Dravathi named Ozek who had 22 years of professional hunting experience and had never, in those 22 years, been made to feel like the prey in his own hunt, filed a separate 4-page addendum to his assessment report. I read it twice. It ended with, "I do not know what this species is precisely, but I know what it is not. It is not prey." The graduation ceremony for Session 47 of the Predator Academy took place on the 41st day, in the main assembly hall of Voth Station, in front of a combined audience of instructors, station staff, and senior military representatives who had traveled from Korahan High Command specifically because word had gotten around about a certain anomalous cadet and everyone wanted to see how it ended. Caden Rourke graduated first in his class, not by a narrow margin. The scores were not close. In the composite assessment that combined the hunger maze, the combat rotation results, behavioral evaluations, and the Keth 9 field assessment, he had placed above every other cadet by a spread that our scoring system had previously only seen when a species was operating so far outside the expected parameters that the algorithm visibly struggled with the output. The ceremony itself was, as I said, quiet. It was not the subdued quiet of boredom or disinterest. It was the specific, weighted quiet of a room full of beings who are paying very close attention and are not entirely sure what they are witnessing. When Caden walked across the floor to receive his commendation, Threx Boravane, 7 feet of Dakari predator, blood-scaled, jaw-cracking, someone who had never in his life performed a voluntary gesture of deference to anything he had not specifically decided to respect, stood up straight, not at attention in any formal sense, not in response to any command. He simply straightened, and his eyes tracked Caden across the room, and he did not move again until Caden had returned to his position. Soraveth did the same, and Bolt Karn. And, quietly, without announcement or ceremony, so did most of the rest of the room. Caden shook my hand at the end of the ceremony. His grip was firm. He looked me directly in all 4 of my eyes. Humans almost always look at whichever of a Korhan's eyes is currently most forward-facing, a small social adjustment they make without apparent conscious effort. And he said, "Good program, learned a lot." Then he picked up his single bag. Still the same bag, still the same canvas, now supplemented by what appeared to be a new jacket, since the original had been systematically dismantled over 6 weeks in service of notes and trap materials, and walked to the shuttle bay. The room stayed quiet until he was gone. Then everyone started talking at once. I submitted my final session report to High Command 3 days after graduation. It was 47 pages. The longest single session report in Voth Station history. I documented the maze, the cafeteria incident, the combat assessments, the dormitory event, the Keth-9 field trial. I documented the tracker team addendums. I included Soraveth's behavioral analysis notes, which she had apparently been keeping independently, and which were, frankly, better than anything my formal staff had produced. The last paragraph of the report, the formal conclusion, the line that I knew would be read by High Command and filed permanently in the Korahan Military Intelligence Archive, read as follows. Homo sapiens are not the strongest species in documented space. They are not the fastest, the most armored, the most venomous, or the most physically formidable. By every standard biological metric used in this institution's 312 years of operation, they should not be here. They have no natural weapons. They have no natural armor. They are, on paper, soft and brief and fragile. But here is what the paper does not say. They have been losing for their entire recorded history, and they have never once, in any documented instance across any conflict in any era on any front, decided that losing was the same thing as stopping. They do not fight because they are the strongest. They fight because the alternative is unacceptable to them on a level that goes past logic or strategy or survival calculus and lives somewhere older than all of those things. They get back up. Every time. With spoons, if that is what is available. With their bootlaces, if that is what remains. Cadet Caden Rourke did not win this program because he was the most dangerous being in it. He won because he was the only one who would have kept going no matter what the answer was. That, High Command, is the distinction. That is what Earth already knew about itself, and what the rest of the galaxy is only beginning to understand. Do not underestimate them. Do not ever make the mistake of thinking that soft means weak. And whatever you do, whatever diplomatic, strategic, or military calculation you run on this species, remember that the clerical error that sent one of them to us by accident has cost me more sleep in 6 weeks than 30 years of commanding the most dangerous training institution in the known galaxy. That is not a complaint. That is a warning. Commander Vreth Okolos Voth Station, Predator Academy Session 47. Final Assessment Report filed. Standard Galactic Date 7.441.09. End of report.